The wind was a blade, thin and sharp, slicing through the threadbare shawl wrapped tight around Alara's shoulders. Snowflakes, hard as grit, stung her cheeks, clinging to the wisps of hair that had escaped her bun. Beneath her worn boots, the frozen ground offered no comfort, only a brittle resistance that mirrored the state of her heart. Her husband was gone, taken by the sickness that swept through the isolated valley, leaving her alone with nothing but a collapsing claim shack, a few meager supplies, and the crushing weight of despair. The nearest settlement was days away, a journey impossible in this weather, with these provisions, in her condition of profound weakness and grief. The whispers had reached her even here, carried on the same cruel wind that stripped the valley bare. Whispers of the man who lived beyond the ridge, the soldier Castian. Disgraced, they said. Killer. Shunned. A final, desperate thought bloomed in the frozen landscape of her mind. They called him dangerous, but the wilderness itself was a far greater, more immediate threat. Survival demanded choices born of desperation, stripping away convention and fear. She stumbled forward, guided by a grim resolve, toward the only possible refuge, the only soul said to inhabit this unforgiving corner of the world. Every step was an agony, a battle against the elements and the terror gnawing at her insides. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, each one a stark reminder of the life clinging precariously within her. The silence of the wilderness was vast, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the crunch of her own faltering steps. Ahead, a faint plume of smoke against the iron-gray sky. It was real. He was real. The fear intensified, sharp and cold, but it was tempered by the primal instinct to live, to find warmth, to find shelter. The shack, when she finally reached it, was smaller than she'd imagined. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a single window dark and unwelcoming. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, a promise of heat, a beacon in the brutal landscape. She hesitated at the door, hand trembling, her gaze fixed on the weathered wood. Every story she'd heard, every fearful warning, echoed in her mind. But the alternative was certain death, a quiet surrender to the snow. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she raised her fist and knocked. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, a challenge flung against the silence. There was a pause, long and heavy, filled only by the relentless wind. Then the creak of the door. He filled the frame, a silhouette against the dim interior. Tall, broad-shouldered, a presence that commanded attention, yet seemed muted, contained. His face was shadowed, but his eyes, when they met hers, were startlingly light, assessing unreadable. They held the stillness of deep water, carrying the weight of unspoken things. He didn't speak, just watched her, a figure of profound stillness against the swirling snow. Her voice, when it came, was a rasp, barely audible above the wind. I need shelter, she managed, the words tearing at her raw throat. I have nowhere else to go. The air crackled with tension, the moment stretching out, fragile and fraught. She braced herself for rejection, for the door to be slammed in her face, for the confirmation of the cruel tales. But he simply opened the door wider, stepping back into the shadows of the cabin's interior. A silent invitation, devoid of warmth, yet offering the one thing she desperately needed: shelter from the storm. She stepped across the threshold into the dim warmth, the scent of wood smoke and something else, something wild and clean, filling her lungs. The door closed behind her with a solid thud, sealing them inside the small space, separating her from the deathly cold outside. The cabin was Spartan. A rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow bunk built into the wall, a stone hearth where a fire crackled low. A few pelts lay scattered on the dirt floor. Nothing soft, nothing decorative, purely functional. He moved with a quiet efficiency, adding a log to the fire, the flames leaping higher, pushing back the shadows. In the increased light, she saw him more clearly. His face was lean, etched with lines that spoke of hardship, or perhaps something deeper. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a pale line against sun-darkened skin. His hair was dark, worn longer than was typical, falling slightly over his collar. He didn't look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the fire, but she felt the weight of his awareness, his silent observation. He gestured towards the other chair with a tilt of his head. "Sit," he said, his voice low, rough, like stones tumbling. It was the first word he'd spoken. She sank onto the chair, her legs trembling, feeling the heat seep into her chilled bones. She watched him, her fear still present, a knot in her stomach, but curiosity now mingled with it. Who was this man? The stories painted him as a monster, but his silence, his understated movements, lacked the overt menace she'd expected. He poured water into a metal cup from a kettle by the fire and set it before her. It was warm, a simple gesture, yet profoundly significant in the context of her recent isolation and suffering. "Thank you," she murmured, clasping the cup, feeling the heat through the metal. He merely nodded, returning to his quiet tending of the fire. The silence settled between them again, not comfortable, but not hostile either. It was a wary, watchful silence, each assessing the other without overt scrutiny. She risked looking around the cabin again. A rifle leaned against the wall. A few tools were neatly arranged. Everything had its place. This was a man who lived deliberately, whose existence was pared down to essentials. The contrast with the life she had known, filled with small comforts and societal expectations, was stark. She was a widow now, alone, her future uncertain, perhaps dependent on the tacit goodwill of a man everyone else feared and shunned. The thought was terrifying but also, strangely, freeing. The old rules no longer applied. Survival was the only rule. She watched him, noting the quiet strength in his hands as he worked the fire, the way his gaze seemed to take in everything without appearing to. He was a man of the wilderness, shaped by it, perhaps scarred by something beyond it. The air in the cabin felt thick with his presence, a contained power that didn't seek to dominate, but simply existed. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the world she had escaped, the world that offered her no quarter. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire, the man's quiet movements, and her own beating heart, slowly, tentatively, beginning to hope. Days bled into a week, then two. The snow continued its relentless assault, trapping them within the confines of the small cabin. The forced proximity chipped away at the initial fear, replacing it with a cautious familiarity. He was a man of few words, Castian. He rarely spoke unless necessary, his communication often limited to gestures, a look, the way he held himself. But his actions spoke volumes. He shared his meager food without comment, tough dried meat, hard biscuits, beans cooked over the fire. He kept the fire going, ensuring warmth. He maintained a quiet routine, tending to tasks outside when the weather allowed brief reprieves, mending things, preparing for the deep winter. He didn't ask about her past, her husband, the circumstances that had led her to his door. Nor did she ask about his. The unspoken pact was one of present necessity. They were two souls adrift, finding temporary harbor in each other's silent company. She began to help in small ways, sweeping the cabin floor, washing the few dishes in melted snow water, mending her threadbare clothes. He accepted her help with a simple nod, never demanding, never effusive. It was a partnership born of survival, grounded in shared space and unspoken needs. She learned to read his moods by the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. She learned that his silences could be companionable, not just withdrawn. She noticed the care he took cleaning his rifle, the precision of his movements. He was watchful, always, his eyes constantly scanning the limited view from the window or the open door, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. It was the vigilance of someone who expected trouble, who lived on the edge. The disgrace that clung to his name remained a mystery, but she saw no cruelty in him. Stern, yes. Aloof, undeniably. But there was a quiet integrity in his actions, a self-contained discipline that hinted at a past she couldn't fathom. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, she found her voice, stronger now, less brittle. Why did you let me stay? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. He paused in the act of sharpening a knife, his movements ceasing for a long moment. His gaze finally met hers, those light eyes piercing the dimness. He didn't offer a comforting lie, no platitude about kindness. His answer was stark, honest in its simplicity. It's a long way to the settlement, and then, after a beat, almost reluctantly, wouldn't have made it. It wasn't kindness he admitted to, but a simple acknowledgement of reality, of the impossibility of her journey. Yet the choice had been his. He could have sent her away to face certain death. He hadn't. It was a small admission, but it felt monumental, a crack in the wall of his reserve. It wasn't love, not yet, not even fondness. It was something far more fundamental. A shared humanity acknowledged in the face of overwhelming hardship. In that moment, the cabin felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a fragile sanctuary, built on a foundation of shared silence and the slow, quiet bloom of trust. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered one biting afternoon. 3 men arrived on horseback, their presence immediately disrupting the quiet rhythm of the wilderness. They were rough-looking, their faces hard and cold under wide-brimmed hats, eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding area with predatory intent. Alara felt a wave of nausea, recognizing the type. Men who respected nothing but force, who saw vulnerability as an invitation. Castian stepped out of the cabin before they even reached the door, the rifle held casually but purposefully in his hands. He stood silhouetted against the falling snow, a still, formidable figure. The lead rider, a burly man with a cruel grin, pulled his horse to a halt a few yards away. "Well, well," the man sneered, his voice loud and grating. "Look what we have here." The hermit and his little squaw, he spat in the snow. "Heard you had something valuable tucked away, Castian." Time to pay up. Alara knew instantly what they were talking about. Not property, not gold. Her. A woman alone was seen as chattel, ripe for the taking. Her blood ran cold, but a fierce, protective instinct flared within her. Not just for herself, but, surprisingly, for the quiet man who stood between them and her. Castian's expression remained unreadable, his body language radiating a quiet, dangerous calm. "Nothing here for you," he said, his voice low, devoid of emotion, yet carrying an unmistakable warning. The second man dismounted, moving towards the cabin with a swagger. "Let's just see about that." As he took another step, Castian raised the rifle slightly. The click of the hammer being cocked echoed in the stillness. The swaggering man froze. The air vibrated with tension. The lead rider's grin tightened. "You always were a fool soldier," he growled. "Think you can take all 3 of us?" Castian didn't reply. He didn't need to. His posture, the steady aim of the rifle, spoke louder than any words. It was the stance of a man who had faced death before, who was prepared to do so again. The moments stretched, taut and agonizing. Alara, watching from the cabin doorway, felt a surge of defiance. She might be small, but she wasn't helpless. She picked up a heavy piece of firewood, holding it like a weapon. The lead rider's eyes flickered to Alara, then back to Castian. He saw the silent challenge, the unexpected resolve in the woman's stance. He saw the absolute readiness in Castian's eyes. These were not easy prey. The cost might be higher than the reward. With a final, frustrated sneer, the rider reined his horse around. "This ain't over, Castian," he yelled, but the threat felt hollow. The other 2 men remounted quickly. They rode away as they had come, swallowed by the falling snow, leaving only the silence and the faint scent of wood smoke. Castian lowered the rifle, the tension draining from his body, replaced by a weary stillness. He looked at Alara, his gaze meeting hers across the short distance. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, abiding weariness. But there was something else too, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Respect? Relief? He looked at the piece of wood in her hand, then back at her face. A faint, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement of her courage, her willingness to stand with him. In the face of the external threat, Their tentative connection had solidified into something stronger, something proven. The incident with the riders left a lingering shadow, a reminder that the world outside their cabin remained hostile. But it also changed things between Alara and Castian. The shared moment of defiance, the silent understanding that had passed between them, had deepened their bond. The air in the cabin felt different, less guarded. He still spoke little, but his silences were warmer now, filled with an unspoken awareness of her presence. He watched her sometimes, when he thought she didn't notice, a quiet intensity in his gaze that was no longer just assessment, but contemplation. She, in turn, saw past the stoic facade more often, saw the flicker of pain in his eyes when something reminded him of a past he couldn't speak of, saw the gentle way he handled a small, injured bird he found near the cabin, fashioning a makeshift splint for its leg. The stories of the disgraced soldier seemed increasingly distant, replaced by the reality of the man himself, complex, wounded, capable of quiet care. She no longer felt like a trespasser, but a companion. The deep winter set in, a siege of snow and ice. They relied entirely on their stores, on Castian's skill at hunting and trapping when the weather permitted. They spent long hours by the fire, the only sounds the wind outside, the crackle of the flames, the soft rhythm of their breathing. In these shared quiet hours, without the need for words, their connection grew. It was forged not in grand declarations, but in shared hardship, mutual respect, and the simple, profound act of being present for one another. The fear that had driven her to his door had long since dissipated, replaced by a quiet trust, and something else, something tender and fragile, blooming like an unexpected wildflower in the harsh landscape of her life. One evening, the storm outside raging, the fire providing the only light, he reached out and covered her hand where it rested on the table. His touch was rough, calloused yet surprisingly gentle. He didn't speak, just held her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken. From strangers bound by desperation to two souls finding solace and strength in each other's company. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, not of sadness, but of release, of a profound sense of not being alone anymore. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the disgraced soldier of rumor, but the man who had saved her, who had shown her quiet kindness in a world that had offered only cruelty. She understood then that resilience wasn't just about enduring the storm, but about finding shelter, finding connection, even in the most unlikely places. Her life had been shattered, redefined by loss and hardship, but it had also been rebuilt, piece by painstaking piece, in the quiet warmth of a cabin nestled against a hostile world, with a man who had been cast out, but who had offered her a home. The future was still uncertain, the valley isolated, the whispers of the outside world a distant threat. But facing it together, they were no longer just surviving. They were beginning to live. She had come seeking refuge, and she had found something far more precious. A partnership built on shared silence, proven courage, and the quiet, undeniable language of the heart.